All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a special class of drugs where the stakes are, honestly, life or death. We're going to tackle a question that millions of people face. When your doctor prescribes one of these and the pharmacy offers you the generic, can you actually trust it? I mean, really think about that. For some medicines, the difference between a dose that helps you and a dose that hurts you is incredibly small, like razor thin. So yeah, when you're handed a generic for one of these critical drugs, you're right to wonder, is it really the same thing? Let's dig in and find out. Okay, so the official name for these drugs is Narrow Therapeutic Index drugs, or NTI for short. And you know what? The name kind of says it all. There's this very, very narrow window, or index, where the drug does its job perfectly. Go a little under and it doesn't work, go a little over and it could be dangerous. We're talking about really important meds here, things like the blood thinner warfarin or levothyroxine for thyroid conditions. You know, for people with epilepsy or who've had an organ transplant, getting this dose exactly right isn't just important, it's absolutely critical. So, to really get why NTI generics are a special case, we first have to understand how any generic gets approved. What's the basic promise the FDA makes when it says a generic is a good substitute for a brand name drug? All right, so the FDA has this really strict three-step playbook. First up is what's called pharmaceutical equivalence. That's a fancy way of saying the generic has to have the exact same active ingredient in the same dose and meet the same quality standards as the brand name. No exceptions. Second, it has to be bioequivalent. This is key. It means the generic has to get absorbed into your bloodstream at the same rate and in the same amount as the original. And they test this in people to make sure. And finally, step 3, inspections. The FDA doesn't care if a factory's in Indiana or India. They inspect manufacturing plants all over the world to make sure they're up to snuff. Okay, so that's the standard process for your everyday generic. But for these NTI drugs, where we've already said a tiny little difference can be a huge deal, you've got to be asking, is that enough? And here's the thing. The FDA says, nope, it isn't. And this right here is where things get really interesting. And this is that extra safety net. Check this out. For a regular generic, the amount of the active ingredient in the pill, they call it the assay limit, can be anywhere from 90% to 110% of what's on the label. But look at the NTI generics. The FDA squeezes that window way down to a much tighter 95% to 105%. And it's the same idea for bioequivalence. That's how the drug gets into your system. The acceptable range is just way, way stricter. This is literally the FDA adding an extra layer of protection just for these specific drugs. So having stricter rules from the FDA is great. It's reassuring. But what about the people who are actually dealing with these prescriptions every single day? You know, the experts on the front lines. To get that real-world view, researchers did something pretty cool. They went right to the source and did a huge national survey of pharmacists. And it makes perfect sense, right? Pharmacists are at the heart of all of this. They're the ones dispensing the pills, they're the ones you and I ask our questions to, and they're the ones making these substitution calls constantly. Their hands-on experience is just invaluable, and that's why a big, rigorous survey like this one was so needed. So what happened when they asked over 2,000 pharmacists from all 50 states what they really think about generic NTI drugs? Well, the answers are pretty fascinating. Okay, get this. The big headline number is a whopping 82%. That's how many pharmacists said that when they get a brand new prescription for an NTI drug, they almost always go ahead and substitute it with the generic. That's huge. It tells you that right out of the gate, their default setting is to trust the generic. But here comes the twist in the story. What about refills? What happens when a patient is already on the brand name drug? They're doing fine, they're stable, and they come in for a refill. Does that 82% confidence carry over? Well, not exactly. Take a look. For refills, that number drops a lot, all the way from 82% down to 60%. So there's a really clear pattern here. Pharmacists are way more comfortable starting someone on a generic than they are switching them over later on. So what's with the hesitation? It really seems to boil down to one thing: patient stability. The researchers don't think this is about pharmacists suddenly distrusting the generic. It's more of a classic, if it ain't broke, don't fix it mindset. You've got a patient who's stable, they're doing well on the brand name drug, Pharmacists are just really cautious about making any change. Even just a pill that looks different could cause confusion or worry, and they want to avoid that. But wait, there's more. When they dug even deeper into the data, they found some more subtle patterns. Not everybody felt the same way. There was some skepticism out there. So the next logical question is, who are the skeptics? And, maybe more importantly, did what they believed always line up with what they did? And this is where it gets really paradoxical, just fascinating stuff. The data show that skepticism was a little bit higher in pharmacists who worked outside of big chain pharmacies, and also among female pharmacists. But, and this is the kicker, those same female pharmacists were also more likely to actually make the substitution to a generic. What gives? So what's happening here? Well, Dr. Wenli Jiang, who is an FDA scientist and one of the study's authors, put it pretty simply. She said, sometimes thoughts and actions may not be consistent. It suggests that a pharmacist can be professionally skeptical, always questioning, which is a good thing, but at the same time, trust the science and the regulations enough to make a substitution that's good for the patient. And there's one more piece to this puzzle we can't forget: state laws. It turns out some states have these special carve-out laws that just add extra red tape. For instance, in North Carolina, if you're refilling an NTI drug, the pharmacist needs to get the okay from both the doctor and the patient before they can switch to the generic. So these kinds of rules can obviously force a pharmacist's hand, no matter what their own professional opinion is. Okay, so let's pull all of this together. We've looked at the FDA's super strict rules. We've looked at what thousands of pharmacists are actually doing in the real world. So what's the bottom line here? What's the verdict? Should you feel confident about taking a generic NTI drug? The evidence really does seem to stack up. Point 1, the FDA doesn't just treat these generics the same, it holds them to a higher standard. We saw the numbers. Point 2, the experts on the ground, the pharmacists, show overwhelming confidence, especially for new prescriptions. And point 3, clinical studies, like a big one on the anti-rejection drug tacrolimus, have shown that these generics work just as well in real, stable patients. It's a pretty strong case. But I know there might be one big question still lingering in your mind. We hear a lot about it, especially with concerns raised in books like Bottle of Lies. It's the fact that, yes, most of our generic drugs are made overseas. So, does that mean they're less safe? Is that the weak link? Well, the FDA's response to this is about as direct as it gets. They are crystal clear. It doesn't matter if a drug is made in the US or overseas. The manufacturer has to go through the exact same tough, rigorous approval process. The FDA says it inspects manufacturing plants for both brand name and generic drugs all around the world. The bottom line is, the rules are the rules, and they're the same for everybody, period. So, we'll leave you with this final thought. A lot of the worry about these specific generic drugs, these NTIs, it comes from a place of thinking there may be a cheaper, not quite as good version. But now you know the truth is, the FDA actually holds them to an even stricter standard than other generics. So how does knowing that change the way you look at the pills in your prescription bottle?